In August 1994, Bayfield, a small industrial city outside Houston, faced a fire that should have been routine. At 10:54 p.m., alarms rang out from LoneStar Industrial, a warehouse stacked with chemicals and cooling equipment. Station 19 rolled out immediately. Inside the lead truck was Lieutenant Daniel Harris, a veteran firefighter with more than a decade of service. Flames tore through the first floor, but what caught Harris's attention was not the fire. Thick clouds of smoke drifted from the underground chamber where the cooling lines ran. At 11:11 p.m., and he radioed his team. He said he could hear auxiliary engines running, and he smelled ammonia stronger than anything from an ordinary fire. Then his signal cut. 14 minutes later, commanders ordered everyone out. Pressure tanks were at risk of exploding. When the crew regrouped outside, one man was missing. Harris never walked out. The only sign of him was a charred helmet lying near the south hatch. By morning, headlines carried the story. Firefighter vanishes in Bayfield chemical blaze. But the fire was only the beginning. Investigators quickly turned toward Harris's personal life. His wife Laura was in the middle of a separation. Their arguments had spilled into the courthouse just days earlier. She became the first suspect. Then suspicion shifted to Rick Johnson, a bar owner with a history of fights with Harris. He drove a black Chevy Blazer, the same type of vehicle spotted near the warehouse. Both endured years of whispers, headlines, and doubt. Yet the case stalled. There was no body, no radio, no direct evidence. What remained was a cold case marked by anger, rumor, and unanswered questions. 5 years later, demolition crews broke open a sealed chamber beneath LoneStar. Inside lay bones, a burned helmet, and plastic restraints. The truth that surfaced pointed not to Harris's wife, not to the bar owner, but to the man no one had suspected, the city's own safety inspector. The discovery rewrote the entire story, exposed corruption, and explained why one firefighter never returned home. This was the disappearance that haunted Bayfield for years, and the cold case that proved even those sworn to protect can hide the darkest secrets.
If this case already has you asking questions, make sure to hit like so more people can see it, and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the story. In the next part, we step back and uncover who Daniel Harris really was, the firefighter behind the uniform, the pressures in his life, and why his disappearance shook Bayfield to its core. Stay tuned, and share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think happened in those 14 missing minutes? It was a night of August 18, 1994. Bayfield, a small industrial town outside Houston, was still heavy with the summer heat. Most nights were quiet. Fire crews handled routine alarms, brush fires, or false calls from old warehouses. But that Thursday would mark the beginning of a story that Bayfield would never forget. At 10:54 p.m., the alarm system at LoneStar Industrial triggered. Dispatch flagged it as a major fire call. The warehouse complex stored chemicals, solvents, and industrial coolants. It sat dangerously close to the railway line and not far from residential streets. The risk of a wider disaster was real. Station 19 responded first. 2 engines rolled out, lights cutting through the night. At the head of the crew was Lieutenant Daniel Harris. Harris was 34 years old, a firefighter with 12 years of service. He had been through refinery blazes, gas explosions, and warehouse fires before. He was steady, known for calm under pressure. That night, he climbed down from engine 19 ready for another hard fight. The men trusted him. When the crew reached LoneStar, flames were already tearing through the front offices on the ground floor. Smoke rolled out from broken windows and vents. But it was not ordinary smoke. It was darker, heavier, carrying a sharp odor that burned the throat. Several firefighters later said they noticed immediately it didn't smell like burning wood or plastic. It smelled chemical. While his crew pulled hoses and attacked the visible flames, Harris scanned the building. He kept glancing toward the south side, where thick clouds drifted upward from a maintenance hatch leading down to the lower chamber. The cooling systems for the plant were installed there. If anything had failed underground, the whole structure could collapse. At 11:11 p.m., Harris radioed in. His voice was calm but firm. "I can hear But the minutes dragged on. By 11:20, there was still no sign of him. At 11:25, the commander on site received a more urgent warning. Pressure tanks inside the plant were unstable. If they went, the explosion could rip through the entire block. With no choice, the order was given. All personnel withdraw immediately. Crews pulled back, hoses abandoned. When the head count was done in the safety zone, one name was missing. Lieutenant Harris. He hadn't come out. The realization hit the team all at once. Men shouted, pointing back toward the hatch. Against orders, several rushed in again through the heavy smoke. They knew the risk, but Harris was one of their own. Near the south hatch, they found something lying in the debris. A helmet, scorched and blackened, the reflective stripes melted. It was Harris's. Nothing else was there. No radio, no flashlight, no body. The hatch itself was scorched but intact, the metal door bent slightly as if it had been forced. Beyond that, visibility was zero. Heat and fumes forced the men back again. Harris was gone. By dawn, the fire was under control, but the search brought no answers. Local reporters were already waiting. The next morning, the Houston Chronicle printed a headline that shook the city. "Firefighter disappears in Bayfield chemical blaze." The disappearance stunned the community. Bayfield had seen industrial accidents before, but never a case like this. A firefighter, trained and experienced, had gone missing inside a burning building with no trace left behind, except a single helmet. Theories spread fast. Some said Harris had been caught in a sudden collapse, buried deep under rubble no one could reach. Others believed the chemicals inside had poisoned him instantly, leaving nothing behind. A darker theory soon followed. Maybe there was more inside Lone Center that night than just a fire. Neighbors whispered about the smell. Workers from nearby plants said they had seen trucks unloading drums at LoneStar after hours. A truck driver told police he had spotted a black Chevy Blazer near the gate around 10:40 p.m. That was the night when a veteran firefighter vanished, leaving behind only smoke, confusion, and suspicion. A night that turned into one of Texas's most haunting cold cases. Daniel Harris grew up in Houston, Texas, the son of a working-class family. His father had worn the same uniform, serving as a firefighter before him. For Harris, the job was not just a career choice, but almost a family tradition. Friends from childhood remembered him as steady, reliable, and determined to follow the same path. In 1982, at just 22 years old, Harris joined the Bayfield Fire Department. His rise was quick. By the early 1990s, he had already been promoted to lieutenant. Colleagues said he was disciplined, calm under pressure, and respected by every man on his crew. He was not the loudest voice in the room, but when a fire broke out, he was the one others followed without hesitation. In 1990, Harris received a commendation that made local headlines. A sudden explosion rocked an oil plant on the outskirts of Bayfield, trapping 3 workers inside. While flames burned out of control, Harris led a small team into the building, cutting through wreckage and dragging all 3 men to safety.
For that, he was awarded a medal for valor. Newspapers called him a real-life hero. For the men who served beside him, he was simply doing what came naturally. Away from the job, Harris lived a quieter life. He married Laura Harris, a nurse at the Lateral Hospital. Together they had one daughter, Emily, just 7 years old in 1994. On the surface, the family looked like an image of middle-class America, a modest home, a hard-working father, a mother in healthcare, and a young child starting school. But inside that home, pressure was building. Long shifts, late nights, and the constant strain of the job weighed heavily on Harris's marriage. Finances added to the stress. In 1991, the couple bought a new house. It should have been a dream, but mortgage payments slipped and credit card debts piled up. Harris worked overtime whenever he could, yet the bills never seemed to shrink. By the summer of 1994, Laura had filed for legal separation. The couple's arguments spilled into public view at the courthouse. To his fellow firefighters, Harris never let those troubles show on the job. He was still the man they could rely on. But some noticed changes. He spoke about it quietly to a few close friends, men he trusted. "Something isn't right," he told them. "Every time there's a leak, there's a fire. Someone is hiding something with smoke." His words were remembered later, when the truth about his disappearance came to light. That notebook became critical. After the fire that took Harris's life, investigators checked his locker at Station 19. His gear was there, his personal items untouched, but the notebook was gone. Not misplaced, not left at home. Gone. No one ever saw it again. For police, the picture of Harris was complicated. On one hand, he was a decorated firefighter. On the other, he was man under pressure, a failing marriage, mounted, and working non-stop. Demecribs wondered if he'd been distracted, if his judgment had slipped the night. They described him in early reports as a man whose was falling apart. But for his theory never made sense. Harris was the type to run, not the anger his post, and certainly not the type to disappear on his. To them, the missing notebook was a clue. He had stumbled at LoneStar, something that threatened to expose a dangerous reality. The contrast fueled debate in. Was Harris simply a victim of a tragic accident, a firefighter lost in a blaze? Or did his disappearance point to something far more deliberate? Had he discovered a secret at LoneStar that someone did not revealed? Those questions turned Harris from a firefighter of a mystery. Below file showed a man respected in uniform, struggling in private, yet carried information that might explain why a routine fire turned in Texas's most haunting. When the fire at LoneStar Industrial, investigators returned to the warehouse. The simple, find any Lieutenant Daniel Harris, instead raised more questions than answers. The hatch Harris had reported heading toward, immediately attention. The next discovery added to the unease. Imprints of heavy work boots were pressed into the dust and ash. The soles measured size 11, typical of steel-toe boots used by plant workers. But firefighters wore standard-issue gear, and none from Station 19 matched the pattern. Whoever left those prints was not part of Harris's crew. Attention turned to the cooling system deep in the basement. Valves on the line had been manually opened. Scratches around the handles suggested someone had twisted them violently, overriding safety mechanisms. Investigators noted it, but in the rush to close the case, the detail was logged and then pushed aside. Witness accounts added another layer. A truck driver waiting at the Rorgan reported seeing a black Chevy Blazer parked by the rear gate at around 10:40 p.m. That was barely 15 minutes before alarms rang. He said 2 men moved quickly toward the warehouse, carrying metal drums. His statement was taken, but like so much else, it was not pursued. Security cameras, mounted along the outer wall, had been destroyed by the fire. Yet one roll of film survived in a guard station, partially burned but still intact. The blurred images showed 2 figures near the hatch. Their shapes were indistinct, but the outlines of containers in their hands were clear. This was not consistent with an accidental ignition. Something had been brought in that night. Despite all this, the search for Harris himself came up empty. His radio, flashlight, and protective equipment were gone. Only his charred helmet had been found the night of the fire. Without a body, investigators wrote in their preliminary report that Harris had most likely been trapped in a collapse, suffocated by smoke, and consumed by the flames. The conclusion was quick. The chemicals were brushed aside as environmental contamination. The tampered lock was labeled incidental. The boot prints were ignored. LoneStar's management insisted the fire was electrical in origin, and with no remains recovered, officials closed ranks. The death of a firefighter was ruled an accident, a tragedy of the job. But Harris's family refused to accept it. His wife Laura told reporters, "Dan doesn't just disappear. Something happened to him down there." His parents and colleagues repeated the same. They believed too many details were being overlooked. Details that made no sense in the story of a simple fire. By the end of the initial inquiry, the unusual evidence at LoneStar was buried under paperwork. What remained was an unresolved mystery. A firefighter had gone into the basement and never returned. The traces of chemicals, the tampered systems, the witness reports, all pushed aside. And so the attention turned elsewhere. If the fire itself could not answer the question, maybe the people closest to Harris could. In the months that followed, investigators and reporters alike shifted focus away from the warehouse and toward Harris's own home. The first person in their sights was his wife, Laura Harris. When the crime scene failed to provide answers, investigators shifted focus to the people closest to Daniel Harris. The first name on their list was his wife, Laura Harris. At the time of the fire, their marriage was unraveling. She had filed for legal separation just weeks earlier, and to detectives that made her a natural suspect. 2 days before the blaze, Laura and Dan had argued in public at the county courthouse. The fight was about custody of their daughter and division of property. Witnesses described raised voices and tense exchanges. To investigators, it was proof of motive. To the press, it was a headline too good to ignore. Financial strain added more weight. The couple's mortgage was overdue. Credit card balances had grown. Each blamed the other for missed payments. Police reviewed bank records and saw a trail of late notices. They believed Laura might have wanted to free herself from debts and obligations tied to Dan. Her alibi became another point of contention. Laura told detectives she worked the late shift at the hospital the night of the fire, then stopped briefly at a friend's house before going home. On paper, that seemed airtight, but shift logs revealed a 30-minute window unaccounted for between her leaving work and arriving at her friend's home. Detectives seized on that gap. In their eyes, it was enough time to drive across town to LoneStar. Then came the discovery in her garage. During a routine search, police found an old pair of protective gloves. They were dusty, stained with what looked like industrial residue. Lab tests did not reveal ammonia or nitrobenzene, but the image of gloves linked to chemicals was enough to paint. The Harris family pushed back. Dan's parents called it character assassination. They told anyone who would listen that Laura had no reason to harm Dan, that despite the separation, she wanted him alive for their daughter's sake. But their voices were drowned out by the drumbeat of scandal. Detectives doubled down. Laura was questioned multiple times. Sessions focused on arguments, missed payments, and jealous anger. Rarely did investigators bring up LoneStar or the missing notebook Dan had carried. The official record filled with notes about marital disputes and emotional instability. The technical evidence from the warehouse gathered dust. And yet as weeks passed, the cracks in the theory grew. There was no DNA linking Laura to the fire. No eyewitness placed her near the scene. The gloves in her garage, while unusual, could not be tied to LoneStar in any meaningful way. The 30-minute alibi gap was troubling, but it was not proof. Still, the damage was done. In Bayfield, whispers spread through neighborhoods and workplaces. Some said Laura had snapped. Others said she had manipulated her shifts to create an opportunity. At the hospital, colleagues treated her with suspicion. Friends stopped calling. Wherever she went, eyes followed. Laura felt the weight of it. As a nurse, she was used to caring for patients, but now she became a patient of public judgment. At the grocery store, people confronted her with accusations. Parents at her daughter's school kept their distance. Even Emily, only 7, bore the stigma of having a mother branded as a suspect. The pressure pushed Laura into isolation. She avoided public spaces, worked fewer shifts, and leaned on the few friends who believed in her innocence. For investigators, that retreat looked like guilt. For her, it was survival. Months dragged on with no resolution. The investigation had stalled. Reporters kept circling back to the failing marriage, the custody battle, the debts. Each story cemented Laura's image as the vengeful wife. What was missing was evidence, hard, physical evidence that could tie her to Dan's disappearance. And that evidence never surfaced. By early 1995, even detectives had to acknowledge the reality. They had suspicion, but suspicion wasn't enough to press charges. The answers pointed in a different direction. Bayfield police turned their attention toward a man with a violent temper, a man who had crossed paths with Dan before. His name was Rick Johnson, a bar owner with a reputation for fights and grudges, and he happened to drive the same model of vehicle spotted outside the warehouse. Rick Johnson was not a stranger to trouble. At 36, he ran a small bar in downtown Bayfield, a place known for late-night fights and noise complaints. Locals described him as short-tempered, a man quick to raise his fists. Police already knew his name before Dan Harris vanished. Months before the LoneStar fire, Dan had broken up a violent fight inside Rick's bar. Rick was arrested that night, fined, and his liquor license suspended for several weeks. To many, it was no surprise that Rick carried a deep grudge against the firefighter who had stepped in and cost him money and pride. The grudge alone might not have meant much. But Rick owned a vehicle that raised serious questions. A black Chevy Blazer, 1990 model, was parked behind his bar most nights. Witnesses at the LoneStar warehouse reported seeing a black Chevy Blazer idling near the south gate around 10:40 p.m., just minutes before the alarm sounded. That detail put Rick squarely in the middle of the investigation. The case against him grew stronger when a gas station attendant came forward. The man claimed Rick bought a container of industrial solvent around 10:30 p.m. on the night of the fire. The transaction record was missing, but the witness insisted it was Rick. Combined with the sighting of his Blazer, this made investigators zero in on him. Rick said he never left his bar that night. He claimed he was working behind the counter, pouring drinks, handling customers. But the bar's cash register records showed no transactions between 10:30 and 11:15 p.m., the exact time window when Dan Harris went missing. That gap in his alibi looked damning. Police pressure mounted quickly. With motive, a vehicle that matched the witness report, and an alibi full of holes, Rick was painted as suspect number 1. Reporters seized the story. The image was too easy. A respected firefighter disappears, and the man who hated him most owns the... But as the investigation continued, cracks appeared in the case. Forensic teams scoured the warehouse ruins. They found chemical residue, footprints, and evidence of tampered cooling valves. None of it connected to Rick. No fingerprints, no DNA, no fibers from his clothing, no direct link to the scene. The gaping absence of physical evidence began to weigh against the accusations. Still, the damage to his reputation was done. The Harris family, desperate for answers, believed Rick had the motive to lash out. Some in the community agreed. Others, however, began to wonder if police had chosen the easy suspect. Was Rick really capable of staging such a complex act inside an industrial facility? Or was he being used as a scapegoat while the real truth lay elsewhere? Meanwhile, Rick's personal life crumbled. Customers abandoned his bar. Locals whispered about him in the grocery store. His family faced constant stares and questions. Though never charged, Rick lived under the weight of suspicion for years. By late 1994, investigators admitted the case against Rick had stalled. Without physical evidence, they could not move forward. But they refused to clear his name. He remained in the shadows of the case, branded in public opinion as the man who might have wanted Dan Harris gone. Yet, as months passed, the spotlight began to shift. Other names surfaced, other details were revisited. Among them was one man who had escaped scrutiny in those early days. Mark Evans, the city's industrial safety inspector. His signature appeared on every LoneStar safety report. He had been at the fire scene that night. Unlike Rick, Evans was never treated as a suspect. But soon questions about him would surface, and they would change the case forever. Mark Evans was not the kind of man anyone expected to be accused of wrongdoing. At 44, he had built a reputation as the industrial safety inspector for Bayfield. He was a fixture at factories, warehouses, and plants, clipboard in hand, pointing out violations or signing off compliance sheets. To the public, Evans was part of the system that kept dangerous places safe. On the night of... But those reports deserved more scrutiny. Evans's name appeared on years of inspection documents for LoneStar Industrial. Every form carried the same conclusion: no serious safety issues, no irregularities, operations within code. Yet Dan Harris had been documenting 6 separate ammonia leaks in his personal notebook. Leaks that should have triggered alarms, reports, and shutdowns. The gap between Dan's notes and Evans's signed reports was striking. At the time, though, no one pressed him about it. While suspicions swirled around Laura Harris and Rick Johnson, Evans's name barely surfaced. The press ignored him. Headlines focused on the angry bar owner with a black Chevy Blazer and the wife filing for separation. Evans slipped into the background, almost invisible. Behind the scenes, however, quiet doubts existed. A few colleagues whispered that Evans was known to overlook problems during inspections. Stories circulated about envelopes passed across desks, inspections signed off without proper reviews. Nothing concrete, nothing that could hold in court, but enough to plant seeds of doubt among those who worked in the same offices. His financial records, had anyone checked them in 1994, told a troubling story. Evans carried heavy personal loans. His lifestyle, country club memberships, vacations, expensive cars, was not easy to explain on a city inspector's salary. These details never entered the original investigation. Police did not request his bank records. They did not connect the dots. The Harris family noticed. Laura, still under suspicion herself, asked repeatedly why Evans had not been questioned. Dan's father, a retired firefighter, raised the issue at a community meeting. "Why are we ignoring the inspector who signed off on the very building my son died in?" he demanded. The response was silence. Officials dismissed the family's concerns, calling them emotional, not evidence-based. Evans, meanwhile, maintained a public image as the steady official. He attended community events, spoke at safety forums, shook hands at charity dinners. People described him as polite, professional, even boring. No one thought the mild-mannered inspector could be hiding anything. The truth was buried by For years, his name faded from the case file. By the late 1990s, most people in Bayfield had forgotten he was even there that night. But for the Harris family, questions lingered. Why had Evans's signature always lined up with times Dan documented chemical leaks? Why did his reports never mention the ammonia odors that firefighters and workers had complained about? And why was a man with his income living far above his means? Those questions remained unanswered until 1999, when the LoneStar warehouse was demolished. Construction crews tearing down the old structure uncovered something that rewrote the investigation. A sealed maintenance shaft, welded shut years earlier. Inside were bones, fragments of a firefighter's helmet, and nylon ties. Forensic tests confirmed it was Dan Harris. His lungs showed ammonia exposure. His wrists bore marks of restraint. It was proof that his disappearance was no accident. Alongside the remains was another discovery. A falsified safety document, charred but legible, carried Mark Evans's signature. Soon, investigators traced phone calls made to his office that night, between 11:10 and 11:20, the very minutes Dan was last heard alive. Bank records showed a large payment deposited to Evans's account from Bayfield Chemical Disposal, the waste company under contract with LoneStar, only days after the fire. The man once ignored as irrelevant was suddenly at the center of the case. But in 1994, no one saw it coming. Evans had worn the mask of a city inspector, the image of a neutral public servant. Police overlooked him. The public forgot him. And by the time new evidence surfaced, 5 years had already passed, and Dan Harris's family had endured half a decade of false accusations, rumors, and unanswered questions. Mark Evans had managed to evade suspicion, protected by his role, his reputation, and the blind spots of investigators. That shield would not last forever, but in those early years his name remained hidden, while others carried the weight of guilt. And when the case finally reopened, Evans would no longer be the overlooked inspector. He would become the prime suspect, the man linked. In 1999, LoneStar Industrial finally shut down. The property was condemned, its reputation ruined by years of safety violations. Demolition crews arrived with torches and heavy equipment to bring down the skeleton of steel and concrete. It should have been routine. Instead, it turned into the breakthrough investigators had been waiting for. While cutting through corroded beams in the basement level, workers noticed something odd. Against one wall sat a sealed cavity, welded shut with thick steel plates. The structure wasn't marked on any blueprint. At first, the crew thought it was an abandoned utility space, sealed off during renovations. But the welds were fresh compared to the rest of the structure, as if someone had closed it off only a few years earlier. Curiosity turned to alarm when they pried it open. Inside, the crew found the unimaginable. A partially collapsed chamber, lined with dust and corroded pipes. Resting in the debris were fragments of human bone. Alongside them lay melted plastic restraints and a fire helmet, charred but still showing the faded number of Station 19. It was the helmet of Lieutenant Dan Harris. The discovery triggered a full forensic recovery. The remains were transported to the Harris County Medical Examiner. Within weeks, the lab confirmed what the family had always feared. The bones belonged to Dan. His lungs told the rest of the story. Microscopic examination revealed damage from prolonged exposure to concentrated ammonia gas. He hadn't died in a collapse. He had been sealed in, left to suffocate in a toxic atmosphere. His wrists carried deep grooves, unmistakable evidence of plastic ties cutting into skin. Dan Harris had not vanished. He had been restrained, hidden, and entombed beneath LoneStar. Then came the papers. Among the rubble, investigators recovered a burned but legible document wedged into a crack in the wall. It was a safety inspection sheet for LoneStar Industrial. The signature at the bottom read, Mark Evans, Industrial Safety Inspector, City of Bayfield. His name, overlooked for years, now sat in the center of the evidence. Detectives went back to 1994 call logs. Technology had advanced, and old telephone records were now easier to cross-reference. What they found shook the timeline. Between 11:10 and 11:20 p.m. on the night Dan disappeared, 2 calls were placed from a payphone less than half a mile from LoneStar. Both were directed to Evans's city office line. The timing aligned almost perfectly with the last radio transmission from Dan Harris. Financial records told the next chapter. Evans, once described as a modest city employee, received an unexplained deposit into his personal account in August 1994. The transfer came from Bayfield Chemical Disposal Inc., a private contractor known for cutting corners on hazardous waste removal. The payment landed in his account 1 week after the fire. The connection was undeniable. By the fall of 1999, the Houston Police Department had no choice but to reopen the case. This was no longer an accident or an unsolved disappearance. It was a homicide hidden in plain sight. The Harris family, long silenced by doubt and rumors, finally had confirmation that Dan's death was the result of foul play. His widow, Laura, spoke publicly for the first time in years, declaring that her husband had been framed by circumstance and betrayed by the very system meant to protect him. The community of Bayfield erupted with anger. For years, attention had focused on Laura Harris as a bitter spouse, or Rick Johnson as a violent bar owner with a grudge. Headlines had labeled them suspects, tarnishing their names. Now, it was clear that the real danger had been inside the system itself. A city inspector, the man entrusted to guarantee safety, had been profiting from negligence while a firefighter paid the price with his life. The press seized on the story. Hidden chamber, hidden truth, one headline read. Another called it the cover-up below LoneStar. News crews descended on Bayfield, demanding to know why Evans had never been properly investigated in 1994, and why crucial signs of chemical tampering had been ignored in the original reports. Public outrage forced city officials to act. A task force was assembled, pulling investigators from Houston and federal agencies. Their mission was clear: trace every link between Mark Evans, Bayfield Chemical Disposal, and the LoneStar fire. For the Harris family, the reopening of the case was bittersweet. After 5 years of doubt, they finally had answers, but those answers carried a grim weight. Dan had walked into that basement alive. He had discovered something he wasn't meant to see, and someone had made sure he never walked back out. As the new century approached, the pieces were falling into place. A sealed chamber, a forged inspection report, suspicious phone calls, and dirty money flowing into the account of a city inspector. For the first time, the truth felt within reach. But one question remained. Who had given the order? And why had Dan Harris become the man they had to silence? Every trail led back to Mark Evans. And so, 5 years after Dan's helmet was found in the ashes, the case that had haunted Bayfield was alive again. What had once been dismissed as tragedy was now recognized for what it truly was: murder. And in the year 2000, investigators prepared to confront the man who had hidden in plain sight all along.